The Dominican Republic is one of the most beautiful tourist paradises in the Caribbean and the world. And although it still has many social problems, it is currently one of the fastest-growing Hispanic American countries economically, widely differentiating itself from its unfortunate neighbor Haiti. Are you interested in learning its history? Alright, then stay until the end of the video. It is estimated that the population of the Spanish island would arrive in 8 migratory periods from the coasts of Venezuela, starting from the year 3000 BC, navigating island by island from the Lesser Antilles to the Greater Antilles. However, due to the lack of competition between peoples, they remained rudimentary for several centuries, dedicating themselves to hunting and fishing without even practicing agriculture. Some of these groups, the Siboney, the Arawaks, and the Caribs. However, the group that came to dominate both in Hispaniola and the rest of the Antilles before the arrival of the Europeans were the Tainos. Archaeologists usually classify them into 3 major groups. The Westerners, who would have occupied almost all of Cuba, the classics on the Spanish island and Puerto Rico, and the Easterners in the Lesser Antilles. Other groups, such as the Guanatabays and the Caribs, would also have been encountered by the Europeans. But speaking purely of the Spanish, the Tainos organized themselves into 5 cacicazgos, that is, religious societies governed by caciques: Marian, Magua, Maguana, and Guadalajara, Guel, and Jaragua. It is known that these Tainos would come into conflict with the Caribs, characterized by their belligerence, and these conflicts would be present right at the arrival of the Europeans in 1492 during the expedition of Christopher Columbus, who would baptize the island with the name of the Spanish, and would found the Fort Christmas in the north of the island. First Spanish settlement in the New World, but that would be destroyed by the Tainos, by order of the chieftain Caonabo. Columbus returned the following year during his second voyage and founded La Isabela, the first European city in the New World, and the capital of the also first viceroyalty, the Viceroyalty of New Granada, whose first viceroy was Columbus himself, succeeded by his son Diego. In 1496, Santo Domingo was founded, while the island continued to be the starting point from where various expeditions to conquer the New World would set sail. In the Spanish, the first bishopric, the first captaincy general, and the first royal audience would also be created. Yes, pioneers in everything. And what happened to the Tainos? Well, due to their military inferiority, they were subdued without much resistance. Some rebellions, like those of the chiefs Atue and Huaracuya, ended up being suppressed, and progressively, the Tainos began to perish both from European diseases to which they lacked immunity and from forced labor, going from about 60,000 in 1500 to 600 by 1530. It also happened that the exploitation of sugarcane came into vogue, and due to the lack of indigenous labor, the Catholic monarchs authorized the importation of African slaves. During these first decades in Hispaniola, a period of prosperity and economic boom would flourish. However, around 1535, and with the newly conquered territories in North America, the Viceroyalty of New Spain was created. The Viceroyalty of New Granada would become the Captaincy General of Santo Domingo under the jurisdiction of New Spain. The following decade would see the founding of the Viceroyalty of Peru, and in response to the new territories filled with gold and silver, the Viceroyalty of New Spain was created. The following decade would see the founding of the Viceroyalty of Peru, and in response to the new territories filled with gold and silver, Spain would lose relevance, and over time fell into oblivion. White settlers, blacks, and indigenous people lived in precarious conditions equally, so racial hierarchies would be weaker than in the rest of the colonies. And of course, Santo Domingo would not be the exception in the process of miscegenation. These conditions would force Dominicans to resort to smuggling trade. Dominicans need to become the most powerful, similar to all Caribbean territories. Like the Spanish, they face constant attacks from mainly English foreign corsairs. Among them, the capture of Santo Domingo by Francis Drake stands out, which would be returned after the payment of compensation to England. As a measure against smuggling, the King of Spain would order the depopulation of the western part of the island so that the population could concentrate in Santo Domingo and thus have good trade. The King of Spain ordered the western part of the island to be depopulated, concentrating the population in Santo Domingo for better trade. The forced relocation, known as the devastations of Osorio, ended disastrously with half of the settlers dying from hunger or disease. This depopulation of the West was taken advantage of by French buccaneers to settle on the island of Turtle to later establish direct control in 1640 of large portions of the western territory of the Spanish, until establishing a colony, which logically would not be recognized by Spain, and would be the beginning of a long conflict. In fact, for France, this colony would continue to be officialized with the Treaty of Ryswick after the War of the 9 Years, thus founding Haiti, Spain. For its part, would promote the migration of Spaniards mainly from the Canary Islands to gain presence on the island, although it would not recognize any French sovereignty until the Treaty of Aranjuez in 1777. The peace between France and Spain would end during the War of Roussillon over bordering continental territories. After the French victory and the consequent Treaty of Basel, the total sovereignty of the island would fall under France. This period is known as the Era of France, which would be ephemeral, as Haiti would continue with the War of Roussillon. It gained its independence in 1804, but the French would not be expelled by Creoles from the Spanish sector of the island until 1809 after the Battle of Palo Hincado, thus beginning the period known as Foolish Spain, where the crown would have little intervention. Given the lack of interest from the peninsula, certain conspiracies would arise to break away from Spanish power. Finally, the former governor, José Núñez de Cáceres, declared independence under the name of Haiti, constitutionally associated with Bolivar's Great Colombia. An independence that only lasted 2 months, as it would be occupied by the Haitian army under the command of Jean-Pierre Boyer. Haiti had gained total control of the island. This period is seen by many as a catastrophe for the Dominican Republic, as Boyer would try to reverse Bolivar's war, pushing the Dominican Republic to suppress the Dominican identity, banning the Spanish language and confiscating the assets of the Catholic Church, as well as expropriating multiple properties from Dominican Creoles, causing many to emigrate. But the most critical thing was the heavy taxes on Santo Domingo to pay for the indemnity for independence from France. With all these injustices, desires for independence would arise with great eagerness and would be reflected in the emergence of the Dominican Republic. Dominican independence is a vision of heroes like Juan Pablo Duarte, who founded a society known as the Trinity, which, by conspiring with other Haitian groups who also wanted to overthrow the Haitian regime, would start the Dominican War of Independence. After 12 years of conflicts, the Dominicans achieved their independence, thus founding the First Dominican Republic with the fighter Peter Santana as president. From a more conservative vision, unlike the liberal ideas of Duarte, who, faced with the loss of political influence, would retire to Venezuela. Santana thus receives a bankrupt government, so he would ask Queen Isabel II of Spain to take control of his country again, thus making the Dominican Republic the only Hispanic country that returned under Spanish rule after its independence. However, this would not be accepted by the liberals, which would lead to the start of the Restoration War, through which the Dominicans would regain their independence, thus establishing the Second Republic. With the new independence, internal conflicts would continue between conservatives, led by Buenaventura Báez, who was still seeking annexation to a power, and liberals, led by Gregorio Luperón. Although during the first governments the conservatives remained in power, with the last overthrow, the conservatives remained in power. With the last overthrow, a new era in Dominican politics would emerge in 1878. Among the following governments, the dictatorship of Ulysses Lillis Uraux stands out, who, although he managed to maintain a period of stability, would incur high debt, especially with the United States. Uraux would end up being assassinated in 1899, leaving the Dominican economy under the control of time. Uncle Sam, after the death of Lillis, would begin a period of political instability with short governments. Although on the economic side, the sugar industry modernized and managed to attract some immigration, which would improve the Dominican economy. However, the debts could not be paid, so the Dominican Republic fell to threats of military intervention from the creditor powers of Europe. This would result in a new Dominican economy, a debt. After the economic control imposed from Uraux, and in honor of the Monroe Doctrine, the United States would occupy the Dominican Republic from 1916. Yes, the Dominicans were losing their independence once again. Although they had lost their autonomy, During this period, the Dominicans managed to reactivate their economy, reduce their debt, and build a network of roads that interconnected the Dominican economy. The American occupation would end in 1924, and after free elections, former President Horace Vazquez would be elected, who managed a stable and prosperous government. But as always, with detractors who doubted him for having extended his term from 4 to 6 years. After a revolution in James, the commander of the National Guard, Rafael Leonidas Trujillo, would rise to power, thus beginning the Trujillo era, considered one of the most bloody dictatorships in America. While there were some positive aspects to his regime, such as economic prosperity and some environmental protection, it was characterized by a cult of personality, personal enrichment, far-right policies, harsh repression, and marked marginalization of Haitians.
Indeed, the Trujillo era is believed to be the most impactful.
Surrounded by victims during his regime, around 50,000 people, many of them during the Bloody Parsley Massacre, in which the Dominican army would murder between 12,000 and 35,000 people of Haitian origin residing in Dominican territory. Despite Trujillo showing a closeness to the United States, there came a point where his regime would cross the line, such as with his attempt at an attack against his rival, Venezuela President Betancourt. For this reason, and to prevent a communist uprising as had happened in Cuba, the Central Intelligence Agency allegedly supported the assassination of the dictator, who would die during an ambush in 1961. After this murder, and amidst tremendous political instability, Juan Bosch would manage to come to power democratically, although he would be overthrown shortly after his triumph. The candidates would come to power in 1965. A revolt sought their reinstatement, which led the country into a civil war, and boom, Second American Intervention, who saw Bosch as a possible Marxist threat. So after a year of a new occupation, they would leave Joaquin Balaguer Trujillo's last puppet president in charge of the government. Balaguer replicated Trujillo's approach by suppressing opposition, despite the U.S. candidates' movements and the looming war. When Balaguer achieved excellent macroeconomic results, this growth did not go hand in hand with an equitable distribution of wealth. After 12 years in power, he would be defeated in his attempt to stay for a 4th term, although after a few years, he would return to power for 3 more periods between 1986 and 1996. Balaguer would be succeeded by Leonel Fernandez of the Dominican Liberation Party. The Dominican Liberation Party, who ruled for 3 terms, during which they achieved economic growth and the privatization of state-owned companies. In addition, they accomplished notable works such as the construction of the subway and the completion of communication routes to tourist spots, an important economic sector of the country. Apparently, Fernandez would leave the Dominican Liberation Party's name in good standing, as Danilo Medina from the same party would succeed him and manage to govern for 2 terms. Medina would come to power promising to invest in social programs, education, and to confront corruption. And with this, we arrive at the present of a country that, while it presents exemplary economic growth, still has to combat high poverty rates. And what do you think? Is the Dominican Liberation Party meeting expectations to turn the Dominican Republic into a democratic country in progress? What do you think of this project? Don't forget to leave your comment. And if you like this video, support me with a like and subscribe to my channel. And if you would like to support this project, any donation on Patreon would be welcome. See you next time.
Subscribe.